5 years had passed since Jake Morrison made his life-changing promise to save Cedar Valley Children's Home, and the ripple effects of that decision had spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. What had started as one man's commitment to 300 children had become a movement that was transforming child welfare across the entire state of Texas. The success at Cedar Valley had attracted attention from government officials, philanthropists, and child welfare organizations nationwide. Jake found himself testifying before congressional committees, consulting with other children's homes, and serving on advisory boards for national child welfare reform initiatives. But, despite the external recognition, his heart remained focused on the daily lives of the children who had become his family. On this particular morning, Jake sat in his office reviewing applications from the newest arrivals to Cedar Valley. The facility now operated at full capacity year-round, with a waiting list of children from across the region. What had once been a struggling institution facing closure had become the most sought-after placement in the state child welfare system. Among the applications was one that stopped Jake's reading completely. The photograph showed a 7-year-old boy named Danny with dark hair and serious eyes that reminded Jake painfully of his own childhood pictures. Danny's story was heartbreakingly familiar: parents killed in a car accident, no relatives willing to take responsibility, multiple failed foster placements because of behavioral problems stemming from grief and trauma. But it wasn't Danny's story that made Jake's hands tremble as he held the application. It was the social worker's name at the bottom of the paperwork, Patricia Wells, the same inspector who had questioned his motives so thoroughly 5 years earlier. Jake reached for his phone and called Patricia directly. "Ms. Wells, this is Jake Morrison at Cedar Valley. I'm looking at Danny Martinez's application, and I wanted to discuss his situation personally." "Mr. Morrison, I was hoping you'd call," Patricia replied, her voice carrying both relief and concern. "Danny is one of the most challenging cases I've handled in recent years. He's been through 4 foster homes in 8 months. Good families, experienced families, but none of them could handle his level of trauma response." Jake studied Danny's photograph more closely. The boy's expression showed a mixture of defiance and hopelessness that Jake recognized from his own mirror during the difficult years after his father's death. "What kind of behavioral issues are we talking about, Patricia?" "Violent outbursts triggered by seemingly minor events. Complete withdrawal for days at a time. Destruction of property when he feels cornered or threatened. Sleep disturbances that affect the entire household. Danny is a good child underneath all the pain, but he needs more specialized care than traditional foster families can provide." Jake had learned over the past 5 years that children like Danny were often the ones who needed help most desperately, but were also the hardest to place successfully. Their trauma responses made them appear dangerous or unmanageable, when in reality they were simply children whose emotional systems had been overwhelmed by loss and instability. "Patricia, I want Danny here at Cedar Valley as soon as possible. Today if we can arrange it." "Mr. Morrison, I need to be completely honest with you. Danny has been violent toward other children when he feels threatened. Our psychologists believe he needs individual placement until his trauma responses stabilize. Placing him in a group setting could be dangerous for everyone involved." Jake stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the playground where dozens of children were enjoying their morning recreation time. Many of these children had arrived with similar warnings about behavioral problems, violence, and inability to function in group settings. With proper support, patience, and understanding, almost all of them had learned to heal and thrive. "Patricia, 5 years ago you questioned whether I had the commitment and resources to help children like these. I've proven that I do. Trust me with Danny. Give me the chance to help him the way we've helped so many others." There was a long pause before Patricia responded. "Mr. Morrison, in the 5 years since my inspection of your facility, I've seen miracles happen at Cedar Valley. Children I thought were beyond help have thrived under your care. But Danny's situation is more extreme than anything you've handled before." "Then, he needs us more than any child who's come before him," Jake replied firmly. "Patricia, every child deserves the chance to heal and find hope. Especially the ones who seem most broken." Later that afternoon, Jake received a call from Dr. Rodriguez, who had reviewed Danny's psychological records in preparation for his arrival. "Jake, I need to prepare you for what we're taking on," Dr. Rodriguez said, settling into a chair across from his desk. Danny's trauma isn't just from the car accident that killed his parents. Our preliminary review suggests possible abuse in at least 2 of his previous placements. He's learning to associate authority figures with pain and betrayal. Jake felt anger surge through him at the thought of adults harming a child who was already suffering from tremendous loss. What does that mean for his treatment and integration here? It means we'll need to move very slowly and carefully. Traditional approaches to behavioral management could actually reinforce his trauma responses. He'll need individual therapy, possibly medication for anxiety and sleep disorders, and a carefully controlled social environment until he learns to trust again. Whatever it takes, Jake said without hesitation. Money is no object, time is no object. This child will have everything he needs to heal. Dr. Rodriguez smiled, recognizing the determination in Jake's voice that had saved so many children over the years. I've already contacted specialists in childhood trauma at the University Medical Center. We'll put together the best support team possible. Danny arrived at Cedar Valley on a Tuesday morning in late September, transported by Patricia Wells and accompanied by 2 boxes of belongings that represented his entire world. Jake watched from his office window as the small boy climbed out of the state car, his movements cautious and defensive, his eyes scanning the environment for potential threats. Jake wanted to rush outside and welcome Danny personally, but Dr. Rodriguez had advised against overwhelming the child with too much attention too quickly. Instead, he watched as Lisa Chen, the educational director, and 2 carefully selected older children approached Danny with calm, patient introduction. Even from a distance, Jake could see the tension in Danny's small body as he evaluated these new people and this new environment. The boy's hands were clenched into fists, and he stayed close to the car as if preparing to run at the first sign of danger. The introduction process took nearly an hour. Danny refused to speak to any of the adults, but eventually allowed 16-year-old Michael, one of Cedar Valley's most successful residents, to show him the recreational facilities. Michael had arrived 4 years earlier with similar trauma responses, and Jake had specifically asked him to help with Danny's transition. Over the following weeks, Jake observed Danny from a careful distance, learning the boy's patterns and triggers while allowing the professional staff to manage the direct intervention. Danny's trauma responses were indeed more severe than anything Cedar Valley had previously encountered. He destroyed furniture when frustrated, attacked other children when he felt cornered, and spent days at a time refusing to eat or speak. But Jake had learned patience during his 5 years of child welfare work, and he understood that healing couldn't be rushed or forced. Dr. Rodriguez implemented a careful treatment plan that gradually introduced Danny to the structure and community of Cedar Valley while respecting his need for control and safety. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after Danny's arrival, during an incident that initially appeared to be a devastating setback. Danny had become agitated during a group activity and had thrown a chair that accidentally struck Emma, now 14 and one of Cedar Valley's unofficial ambassadors for new children. Emma had been knocked to the ground and bruised her shoulder, and the staff moved quickly to separate Danny from the other children while ensuring Emma received appropriate medical attention. Jake expected Danny to retreat into the withdrawn, defensive state that had characterized his first weeks at the facility. Instead, something unexpected happened. Danny approached Emma while she was sitting in the nurse's office with an ice pack on her shoulder, and he spoke his first complete sentence since arriving at Cedar Valley. "I'm sorry I hurt you. I didn't mean to hurt you." Emma looked up at Danny with the wisdom that came from her own experiences with trauma and loss. "I know you didn't mean it, Danny. Sometimes when we're scared, we do things we don't want to do. Are you going to tell them to send me away?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma shook her head firmly. "Nobody gets sent away from here for making mistakes. Mr. Jake says this is our home, and families don't give up on each other." Jake watched this interaction through the nurse's office window, his heart breaking and healing simultaneously. Emma's words captured the essential philosophy that had guided Cedar Valley's success: unconditional acceptance, unlimited patience, and unwavering commitment to helping every child heal and grow. From that day forward, Danny's progress accelerated dramatically. He began participating in individual therapy sessions with Dr. Rodriguez started attending educational activities with other children, and gradually learned to trust the adults who were committed to his well-being. The transformation wasn't easy or linear. Danny still had difficult days when his trauma responses overwhelmed his coping mechanisms. But he also had good days when his natural intelligence and humor shined through the pain. Most importantly, he learned that the good days didn't erase the bad days, and the bad days didn't cancel out the good days. Both were part of the healing process. As Danny's first year at Cedar Valley progressed, Jake began to see echoes of his own childhood resilience in the boy's gradual recovery. Danny discovered a talent for mathematics and spent hours working through advanced problems with the volunteer tutors Jake had recruited from local colleges. He also developed a special relationship with the facility's therapy horses, finding peace and comfort in caring for animals that didn't judge or pressure him to heal faster than he was ready. Meanwhile, the other children Jake had rescued continued their own journeys toward adulthood and independence. Maria, now 13, had been accepted into a special summer program for gifted students interested in veterinary medicine. She spent her days shadowing local veterinarians and her evenings helping younger children overcome their fears of animals. Tommy, 17 years old and preparing for college, had published a collection of short stories about children overcoming adversity. The book had been picked up by a major publisher, with proceeds donated back to Cedar Valley's educational programs. Tommy's success had inspired other children to explore their own creative talents, leading to the establishment of an arts program that included music, visual arts, and creative writing. Sarah, now in her junior year of college studying social work, returned to Cedar Valley every semester break to mentor teenagers who were approaching the transition to independent living. Her success had become proof to current residents that the support and education they received at Cedar Valley could truly transform their life trajectories. But it was the recent graduates who provided Jake with the deepest satisfaction and the clearest evidence that his promise had been worth keeping. Robert, the teenager who had initially distrusted Jake's motives, had completed his automotive training program and opened his own repair shop in a nearby town. He employed 3 other Cedar Valley graduates and donated a portion of his profits to support the facility's vocational training programs. Marcus, who had tested Jake's commitment by stealing petty cash during his first month, had become a youth counselor specializing in helping children who had aged out of the foster care system. His understanding of trauma and abandonment, combined with his personal experience of healing, made him exceptionally effective at reaching children whom other counselors couldn't help. These success stories had attracted national attention to Cedar Valley's model of care, and Jake found himself consulting with wealthy philanthropists who wanted to replicate similar facilities in other states. He'd helped establish 3 similar children's homes across the country, sharing both the successes and the challenges he'd learned through 5 years of intensive experience. During one such consultation meeting, Jake met Elizabeth Harrison, a technology entrepreneur who had recently sold her company for several $100 million. Elizabeth was considering funding a children's home in California, but she wanted to understand the personal cost of such a commitment before making her decision. "Mr. Morrison, I've read about your success with Cedar Valley, but I want to understand the reality behind the headlines," Elizabeth said during their meeting. "What has this commitment actually cost you personally?" Jake considered the question carefully. In financial terms, he'd invested nearly $50 million in Cedar Valley over 5 years, dramatically reducing his personal wealth. His oil business continued to generate income, but most of those profits were now dedicated to the children's home rather than his personal enrichment. In lifestyle terms, he'd given up the freedom and social status that came with being a wealthy bachelor. His days were structured around children's needs rather than business opportunities or personal interests. He rarely traveled, seldom socialized with other wealthy individuals, and had essentially traded the life of a successful businessman for that of a full-time father to 300 children. "Elizabeth, this commitment has cost me everything I thought I wanted and given me everything I actually needed," Jake replied finally. "I'm not as wealthy as I was 5 years ago, but I'm richer in ways I never understood were possible." "Do you ever regret the decision?" Jake thought about Danny, slowly learning to trust and hope again. He thought about Maria's excitement about veterinary school, Tommy's published book, Sarah's determination to help other children in need, and dozens of other children whose lives had been fundamentally changed by the commitment he'd made. Elizabeth, 5 years ago I made a promise to honor my mother's memory by helping children who needed a second chance at childhood. That promise has become the most meaningful work of my life. I don't regret a single dollar spent or a single sacrifice made. 6 months later, Jake received a phone call that would test his commitment in an entirely new way. Rebecca called from Dallas with news that their uncle had died, leaving Jake an unexpected inheritance of $30 million. "Jake, this is your chance to rebuild your personal wealth," Rebecca said during their conversation. "You've proven your point with Cedar Valley. You've saved those children and created an amazing facility. But you've also nearly bankrupted yourself in the process. This inheritance could restore your financial security." Jake listened to his sister's concerns, understanding her worry about his financial future. But, as they spoke, his eyes wandered to the framed photographs covering his office walls, hundreds of pictures of children who had found healing and hope at Cedar Valley. These weren't just success stories or charitable causes. They were his family, his legacy, his life's greatest achievement. "Rebecca, what do you think our mother would want me to do with this money?" There was a long pause before Rebecca answered. "She'd want you to help more children, wouldn't she?" "She'd want me to keep the promise I made," Jake confirmed. "And that's exactly what I'm going to do." The inheritance allowed Jake to establish an endowment fund that would ensure Cedar Valley's operations could continue indefinitely, even beyond his lifetime. The fund would generate enough annual income to support the facility's operations while also allowing for expansion and improved services. More importantly, the financial security provided by the endowment allowed Jake to focus entirely on the mission of helping children rather than worrying about fundraising or long-term sustainability. Cedar Valley could now serve as a permanent beacon of hope for children who needed specialized care and unconditional love. On the 5th anniversary of his promise to save Cedar Valley, Jake stood once again in the renovated dining hall, watching children eat breakfast together. The scene was similar to 5 years earlier, but everything had changed. The children were different individuals, but they shared the same sense of belonging and hope that had characterized the facility since Jake's intervention. Danny, now 8 years old and thriving, sat at a table with Maria and 2 newer residents, helping them learn the unspoken rules and traditions that made Cedar Valley feel like home. His transformation from a traumatized, violent child to a confident, caring young boy represented the ultimate validation of Jake's approach to child welfare. As Jake observed the morning routine, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 5 years earlier, he'd been a successful businessman with more money than he knew how to spend meaningfully. Today, he was a father to hundreds of children, a mentor to young adults building their own lives, and an advocate for systemic changes in child welfare policy. The promise he'd made to his dying mother had evolved into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. It wasn't just about providing financial support or safe housing for children in need. It was about creating a community where every child could discover their unique talents, heal from their past traumas, and build confidence in their ability to create meaningful futures. Dr. Rodriguez joined Jake at his observation window, following his gaze toward the children in the dining hall. "Jake, do you ever wonder what your life would have looked like if you'd made different choices 5 years ago?" Jake smiled, thinking about the alternative path he could have taken. He could have continued building his oil business, accumulating more wealth, enjoying the lifestyle and status that came with financial success. He could have married, started a traditional family, traveled the world, and pursued the pleasures that money could buy. "I think about it sometimes," Jake admitted. "But I can't imagine a life more fulfilling than this one. These children have taught me that love multiplies when you share it, that hope grows stronger when you nurture it in others, and that the most important promises are the ones that cost everything to keep." As if summoned by their conversation, Danny appeared at Jake's office door, holding a handwritten letter decorated with crayon drawings of cowboys and children. "Mr. Jake, I wrote this for you," Danny said, his voice confident and clear. "Dr. Rodriguez helped me with some of the big words." Jake accepted the letter and read Danny's carefully written message. "Dear Mr. Jake, thank you for keeping your promise to take care of us. Before I came here, I thought all grown-ups would hurt me or leave me. But you stayed even when I was mean and scared. You taught me that families can be made from love, not just from being born together. I promise to help other kids the way you helped me. Love, Danny. Jake knelt down to Danny's level, his eyes misting with emotion. Danny, this is the most beautiful letter anyone has ever written to me. Can I keep it forever? Danny nodded seriously. It's yours to keep, just like we're yours to keep. As Danny returned to his breakfast, Jake carefully placed the letter in his desk drawer next to dozens of similar treasures from children whose lives had been transformed by love, commitment, and the understanding that some promises were worth everything. The millionaire cowboy who had once measured success in dollars and oil wells now measured it in healed hearts, restored hope, and children who had learned to dream again. His mother's influence had guided him to this moment, but the children of Cedar Valley had completed his education in what truly mattered in life. Jake Morrison's promise had been kept, not just once, but every single day for 5 years. And, as long as there were children who needed hope, love, and a second chance at childhood, he would continue keeping that promise for the rest of his life. The true measure of a man wasn't found in what he accumulated, but in what he was willing to give away. And Jake had discovered that the most valuable thing anyone could give away was love, because it was the only gift that grew larger the more you shared it. 6 months after Jake Morrison signed the papers to save Cedar Valley Children's Home, he stood in the renovated dining hall watching 300 children eat breakfast together for the first time since the rescue. The transformation had been nothing short of miraculous, but the real work was just beginning. The facility buzzed with energy that Jake had never experienced during his Christmas visits. Solar panels gleamed on every rooftop, cutting energy costs by 80%. The old, cracked playground had been replaced with state-of-the-art equipment designed for children of all abilities. Gardens stretched across 5 acres where kids learned to grow their own vegetables, and a new computer lab hummed with the latest technology. But the most dramatic change wasn't in the buildings or equipment. It was in the children themselves. Maria, the 8-year-old who wanted to be a veterinarian, now spent her afternoons helping care for the therapy horses Jake had brought to the ranch. Her nightmares had nearly stopped, and she spoke excitedly about the animals she'd learned to heal someday. Tommy, the boy who couldn't see properly, now wore new glasses and was reading 3 grade levels above his age. The quiet child had discovered a gift for writing, and his short stories about adventure and friendship had become popular bedtime reading for the younger children. Sarah, who had been 16 and terrified of aging out, was now 17 and thriving in the facility's new college preparation program. Jake had hired former admissions counselors from major universities to help older children navigate scholarship applications and career planning. Sarah had already been accepted to 3 colleges with full scholarships. Yet for all the visible progress, Jake was learning that rescuing children involved challenges no amount of money could solve. Each child carried invisible wounds that required patience, understanding, and sometimes professional intervention that took years to complete. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the child psychologist Jake had hired as the facility's director of mental health services, had become his closest advisor on the emotional aspects of childcare. During their weekly meetings, she helped him understand the complex trauma that many of the children had experienced. "Jake, you've created something incredible here," Dr. Rodriguez said during one of their sessions. "But we need to talk about realistic expectations. Some of these children have been through things that would break most adults. Healing takes time, and sometimes it takes steps backward before moving forward." Jake nodded, thinking about recent incidents that had tested his patience and resolve. 2 weeks earlier, Marcus, a 14-year-old who had been abandoned by 3 different foster families, had stolen money from the facility's petty cash box. When confronted, he'd lashed out with anger that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. "Marcus isn't a bad kid," Dr. Rodriguez had explained afterward. "He's a scared kid who has learned that adults can't be trusted. Taking that money wasn't about wanting things he couldn't have. It was about testing whether you'd abandon him too when he made a mistake." Jake had spent 3 hours sitting with Marcus that night, not lecturing or punishing, but simply being present while the boy worked through his emotions. Eventually, Marcus had returned the money and apologized, but, more importantly, he'd started to believe that maybe this adult wouldn't disappear when things got difficult. These moments were becoming common as children tested the boundaries of Jake's commitment. Some acted out with violence, others withdrew into silence, and a few tried to run away entirely. Each incident required a different approach, and Jake was learning that being a father figure to 300 children meant developing patience he never knew he possessed. The staff Jake had hired were exceptional professionals who understood childhood trauma, but even they faced challenges that kept everyone learning and adapting. Lisa Chen, the facility's educational director, had previously worked in prestigious private schools. Cedar Valley presented problems she'd never encountered in environments where children came from stable, supportive homes. "We have kids performing at college levels sitting next to others who are years behind academically," Lisa explained during a staff meeting. "Traditional classroom approaches don't work when you're dealing with students who've moved between 15 different schools, or who missed entire years of education due to family instability." Jake had authorized the development of individualized learning plans for every child, regardless of cost. Some needed intensive tutoring to catch up, others required advanced coursework to stay challenged, and many needed therapy to address learning disabilities that had been ignored in their previous situations. The results were remarkable. Children who had been written off as problem students began discovering talents and interests they'd never had the opportunity to explore. A boy named David, who had been labeled as having behavioral problems, turned out to be gifted in mathematics but had been acting out because he was bored in classes that moved too slowly for his abilities. Meanwhile, a girl named Jennifer had been considered learning disabled but actually had severe anxiety that prevented her from performing well on traditional tests. Once the staff developed alternative assessment methods, her true intelligence became apparent. Jake found himself spending more time at Cedar Valley than at his ranch, drawn by the daily discoveries about each child's unique potential. He'd converted a small apartment on the facility grounds into his personal residence, wanting to be available whenever children needed support or guidance. The transition hadn't been easy for Jake personally. His lifestyle had completely changed from that of a successful businessman to something resembling a combination of father, mentor, and crisis counselor. He no longer attended industry conferences or social events in Dallas and Austin. Instead, his calendar was filled with school concerts, therapy sessions, and bedtime story readings. Some of his wealthy friends couldn't understand the change. During a rare visit to Austin for a banking meeting, Jake encountered William Harrison, a fellow oil executive who had made similar wealth through energy investments. "Jake, I heard about your little charity project," William said over drinks at an exclusive country club. "I admire the generosity, but when are you going to get back to business? You're missing out on the biggest oil boom in Texas history while you're playing house with a bunch of kids." Jake studied William's face, remembering when he might have shared similar priorities. "Those kids aren't a project, William. They're my family now." William laughed, thinking Jake was exaggerating for effect. "Come on, Jake. Family is blood. These are charity cases. You've done your good deed, thrown millions at a problem, and made yourself look like a saint. But surely you're not planning to waste your entire fortune on this." "I'm not wasting anything," Jake replied calmly. "I'm investing in the most important project of my life." The conversation continued for another hour, with William trying to convince Jake to return to profit-focused business ventures. By the end, Jake realized how much he'd changed. The things that once motivated him, wealth accumulation, business expansion, social status, now seemed hollow compared to watching a child overcome trauma and discover their potential. Back at Cedar Valley, Jake faced challenges that tested his commitment in ways William could never understand. The state regulatory system required constant navigation, with inspectors appearing regularly to ensure compliance with dozens of different requirements. Some officials were supportive of Jake's efforts, while others seemed suspicious of his motives. During one particularly difficult inspection, a state social worker named Patricia Wells spent 3 days examining every aspect of the facility's operations. She questioned staff extensively, interviewed children privately, and scrutinized financial records with the intensity of a forensic accountant. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia said during her exit interview, "I have to ask about your long-term intentions here. We've seen wealthy benefactors start projects like this with great enthusiasm, only to lose interest when the novelty wears off. What happens to these children if you decide you're tired of playing philanthropist?" The question stung because Jake understood why she had to ask it. Children in the system had been abandoned by too many adults who had initially promised stability and love. Patricia's job was to protect them from experiencing that trauma again. Ms. Wells, I understand your concern, but this isn't a hobby or a phase for me. I've restructured my entire life around these children. I've moved my residence here, dedicated my wealth to their care, and made legal commitments that extend far beyond my lifetime. Jake pulled out a folder containing legal documents he hoped he'd never need to use. If something happens to me, my estate is structured to continue funding Cedar Valley for at least 25 years. My sister has power of attorney to ensure the facility continues operating according to my wishes. This isn't dependent on my mood or interest level. Patricia reviewed the documents carefully, her professional skepticism gradually giving way to impressed surprise. Mr. Morrison, in 15 years of child welfare work, I've never seen this level of legal and financial commitment to a children's facility. These children have been let down by too many adults already, Jake replied. I won't be another disappointment in their lives. The inspection resulted in the highest rating Cedar Valley had ever received, but Jake knew that external approval mattered less than the daily proof that his approach was working. Children who had arrived angry, scared, and distrustful were gradually learning to hope again. One evening, while Jake was helping with homework in the study hall, 9-year-old Emma approached his desk with a drawing she'd made in art class. Emma had arrived at Cedar Valley 6 months earlier after her grandmother, who had been raising her, passed away. She'd spent the first month refusing to speak to anyone, communicating only through tears and the occasional nod or shake of her head. Mr. Jake, I made this for you, Emma said quietly, holding out a crayon drawing of a cowboy standing next to a house filled with children. Jake accepted the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. In the picture, the cowboy was smiling, and hearts floated above the house like balloons. At the bottom, Emma had written in careful lettering, "Thank you for giving us a home." Emma, this is beautiful, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Can you tell me about it? That's you, Emma explained, pointing to the cowboy figure. And that's all of us in our house. We're happy because we're safe now. Jake knelt down to Emma's eye level, remembering how small and vulnerable he'd felt as a child when his own world fell apart. Emma, do you feel safe here? She nodded solemnly. My grandma used to tell me that angels watch over children who don't have parents. I think you're our angel, Mr. Jake. That conversation stayed with Jake for weeks. He'd never thought of himself as an angel, quite the opposite, actually. He was just a man trying to keep a promise and discovering that love could multiply infinitely when shared with children who desperately needed it. But the challenges continued to test everyone at Cedar Valley. Older children still struggled with the transition to independent living, despite the comprehensive support programs Jake had implemented. 16-year-old Robert had been in the system since he was 7, moving between 12 different placements before arriving at Cedar Valley. He'd learned to survive by never getting attached to people or places, and the stability Jake offered felt threatening to his carefully constructed emotional defenses. I don't trust this place, Robert confided to Dr. Rodriguez during a therapy session. Rich people don't just give away money for nothing. There's always a catch, always something they want in return. Dr. Rodriguez shared Robert's concerns with Jake, who asked to speak with the teenager privately. They met in Jake's office on a quiet Saturday evening, with rain pattering against the windows and a fire crackling in the fireplace. Robert, Dr. Rodriguez tells me you're worried about my motivations for helping you and the other children here. I want you to feel comfortable asking me anything. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his natural defensiveness warring with curiosity. Why are you really doing this? Nobody gives up millions of dollars just to be nice. Jake considered his answer carefully. Robert had been betrayed by too many adults to accept simple explanations about kindness and generosity. You're right that people usually want something in return for their money, Jake said finally. I do want something from you and the other children here. Robert's expression hardened, as if his worst suspicions had been confirmed. I want you to succeed, Jake continued. I want you to graduate from high school, maybe go to college if that interests you, find work you enjoy, build relationships with people who care about you. I want you to have the chance to become whoever you're meant to be. That's it? Robert asked skeptically. That's everything, Jake replied. Robert, when I was your age, my family had nothing. I succeeded because a few people believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Now I have the resources to be that person for others. What I get in return is the knowledge that I've used my wealth for something meaningful. Robert studied Jake's face for signs of deception or hidden agendas. After several minutes of silence, he asked, "What if some of us don't succeed? What if we mess up or fail at things? Then, we'll figure out how to help you try again," Jake answered without hesitation. Failure isn't the end of anything, Robert. It's just information about what doesn't work, so we can try something different. That conversation marked a turning point in Robert's attitude towards Cedar Valley. He began participating more actively in programs, formed friendships with other residents, and eventually asked Jake to help him apply for a community college automotive program. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real. By the end of Jake's first year as Cedar Valley's owner and primary benefactor, the facility had become a model that other children's homes studied and tried to replicate. Educational outcomes had improved dramatically, with 90% of children performing at or above grade level. Behavioral incidents had decreased by 70%, and the facility's reputation attracted child welfare professionals from across the country. But, for Jake, the statistics mattered less than the individual stories of healing and growth he witnessed daily. Children who had arrived broken and hopeless were learning to trust again, to dream again, to believe that their futures could be different from their pasts. During the facility's first annual celebration dinner, Jake stood before the assembled children, staff, and community supporters to reflect on what they'd accomplished together. Looking out at 300 faces that had become as familiar as family, he felt his mother's presence more strongly than ever. "A year ago, many people told me I was crazy to take on this challenge," Jake began. "They said I'd never be able to make a real difference, that the problems were too complex and the costs too high. They were wrong about the costs being too high, but they were right about the problems being complex." Jake paused, making eye contact with children throughout the crowd. What those people didn't understand is that love isn't complicated, even when everything else is. You don't need special training to care about someone. You don't need a degree to listen when someone is hurting. You don't need wealth to offer hope. He gestured toward the staff members scattered throughout the audience. What you do need is commitment, patience, and the willingness to keep trying even when things get difficult. Everyone in this room has shown those qualities over the past year. Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued. "We haven't just rebuilt a children's home. We've created a family. Not a perfect family, no family is perfect, but a real family where everyone belongs, everyone matters, and everyone has the chance to become their best selves." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Jake barely heard it. His attention was focused on the faces in front of him: Maria, who was now 9 and already talking about veterinary school; Tommy, whose writing had been published in the local newspaper; Sarah, who had started her freshman year of college with full academic scholarships; Emma, who had become the facility's unofficial welcome ambassador for new children; Robert, who was thriving in his automotive program and had asked Jake to attend his graduation ceremony. These children had taught Jake that success couldn't be measured in dollars accumulated or properties owned. Real success was measured in lives changed, hopes restored, and promises kept. His mother would have been proud, not because he'd become wealthy, but because he'd learned what wealth was truly for. As the celebration continued around him, Jake made a silent promise to continue this work for the rest of his life. The children of Cedar Valley had saved him as much as he'd saved them, showing him that the most important investments were the ones made in human hearts and human potential. The first year had been about rescue and stabilization. The second year would be about growth and expansion, not just of programs and facilities, but of the love and hope that had transformed a failing children's home into a beacon of possibility for every child who needed a second chance at childhood. The sun painted the Texas sky orange as Jake Morrison stepped out of his custom-built ranch house, his boots clicking against the polished wooden porch. At 42 years old, Jake owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties, with oil wells dotting his land like steel flowers blooming money. His bank account held more zeros than most people could count, but something was missing from his life that all the money in the world couldn't buy. Jake had built his fortune from nothing. 25 years ago, he was just another poor kid from the wrong side of Amarillo, wearing hand-me-down clothes and dreaming of something bigger. His daddy had died in an oil rig accident when Jake was 15, leaving behind nothing but debt and broken promises. His mama worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, but she never complained, never showed how tired she really was. The memory of his mother's sacrifice drove Jake every single day. Mary Morrison had died 5 years ago, just as Jake's business empire was taking off. She never got to see him become successful, never got to enjoy the comfortable life he had planned to give her. That regret ate at him like acid, making every dollar feel hollow. On this particular morning, Jake wasn't thinking about cattle prices or oil revenues. His mind was on a letter he'd received 3 days ago from Cedar Valley Children's Home, the same place where he'd volunteered every Christmas for the past 10 years. The letter was different this time. It wasn't asking for his usual donation. Instead, it carried news that would change everything. The children's home was closing. After 60 years of caring for orphaned and abandoned children, Cedar Valley couldn't survive the budget cuts and declining donations. 300 kids would be scattered across different facilities, separated from friends who had become family. Some would end up in overcrowded state institutions. Others might never find permanent homes at all. Jake folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket, right next to his heart. He thought about all the Christmas mornings he'd spent at Cedar Valley, watching kids light up over simple gifts that cost him pocket change. These weren't just statistics on paper. He knew their faces, their dreams, their fears. There was Maria, an 8-year-old girl with pigtails who wanted to be a veterinarian. She'd lost her parents in a car accident and still had nightmares about the crash. Tommy was 12, a quiet boy who loved reading but struggled in school because he couldn't see properly. The home couldn't afford to get him glasses. Sarah was 16 and aging out of the system soon, terrified of facing the world alone with no family to support her. Jake had money, more than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But what good was wealth if he couldn't use it to help the people who needed it most? His mother had always taught him that real success wasn't measured by what you accumulated, but by what you gave away. That morning, Jake made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He called his lawyer, his accountant, and the director of Cedar Valley Children's Home. By noon, he had scheduled meetings that would either make him a hero or a fool, depending on how people looked at it. The first meeting was with his business manager, Robert Chen, a sharp man in his 50s who had helped Jake multiply his wealth over the past decade. Robert sat across from Jake's mahogany desk, reviewing financial reports with the intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. "Jake, your portfolio is performing exceptionally well," Robert said, adjusting his glasses. "The oil wells alone are generating $8 million annually, and cattle futures are looking strong. You're in a position to expand significantly if you want to." Jake leaned back in his leather chair, studying Robert's face. "What if I told you I wanted to do something completely different with the money?" "Different how? Another business venture? Real estate investment?" "Nothing like that," Jake said quietly. "I want to save a children's home." Robert's pen stopped moving. He looked up from his papers with confusion written across his features. "I'm sorry, can you repeat that?" Jake pulled out the letter from Cedar Valley and placed it on the desk between them. "This place is closing. 300 kids will lose their home. I want to stop that from happening." Robert read the letter twice before responding. "Jake, this is admirable, but we're talking about a charity donation. Even a substantial one wouldn't require this kind of meeting." "I'm not talking about a donation," Jake said, his voice steady and determined. "I'm talking about taking over the entire operation. Buying the facility, funding the programs, hiring the staff, providing for every single child until they're ready to face the world on their own." The silence in the room stretched for nearly a minute. Robert set the letter down carefully, as if it might explode. "Do you understand what you're suggesting? The ongoing costs alone would be millions annually. Food, staff salaries, education, healthcare, facility maintenance, legal compliance. You'd essentially be running a small city." "I understand perfectly," Jake replied. "And I want to do it. Robert pulled out his calculator and started running numbers. After several minutes of frantic typing, he looked up with concern. Based on my preliminary calculations, you're looking at an initial investment of 15 to 20 million just to bring the facility up to modern standards. Then, you'd need 4 to 6 million annually for operational costs. Jake, this could consume your entire fortune within a decade. Jake stood up and walked to the window overlooking his ranch. Hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and oil pumps worked steadily, pulling wealth from deep underground. All of this success felt meaningless when compared to the faces of children who needed help. Robert, when I was 15, I made a promise to myself and to my mother. I promised that if I ever made it big, I wouldn't forget where I came from. I promised I'd help other people who were struggling the way we struggled. Jake turned back to face his business manager. My mother died before I could keep that promise to her. But I can still keep it to myself and to those kids. Robert shook his head slowly. Jake, I admire your heart, but I have a professional obligation to protect your financial interests. This isn't an investment, it's financial suicide. What happens when the money runs out? What happens to those children then? The money won't run out, Jake said with quiet confidence. I'll make sure of it. How can you possibly guarantee that? Jake smiled for the first time that day. Because I'm not just throwing money at a problem, Robert. I'm going to build something sustainable. Solar panels for energy independence. Gardens and farms to grow our own food. Educational programs that prepare older kids for jobs and college. Partnerships with businesses for apprenticeships and internships. This won't be charity, it'll be a community. Robert stared at his client for a long moment, recognizing the determined look in Jake's eyes. It was the same look Jake had worn when he decided to buy his first oil lease with borrowed money, or when he'd mortgaged everything to expand his cattle operation. When Jake Morrison made up his mind about something, arguing was pointless. If you're determined to do this, Robert said finally, then we need to do it right. Legal structures, non-profit status, board oversight, financial safeguards. This can't be a whim, Jake. Too many lives depend on it. Agreed, Jake said, extending his hand. Set up meetings with lawyers, accountants, and child welfare experts. I want to understand every aspect of this before I make my final decision. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake's ranch house became a command center for the most important project of his life. Lawyers explained the complex regulations governing children's homes. Child psychologists described the unique challenges of caring for traumatized kids. Former administrators from other facilities shared their experiences, both successful and cautionary. The numbers were staggering. Beyond the immediate costs, Jake would need to navigate federal regulations, state licensing requirements, and ongoing inspections. He'd be responsible for hiring qualified social workers, teachers, counselors, and medical staff. Every decision would be scrutinized by government agencies and child welfare organizations. But, the more Jake learned, the more determined he became. These weren't just obstacles, they were opportunities to build something better than what existed before. Most children's homes operated on shoestring budgets, cutting corners wherever possible. Jake's facility would be different. It would be a place where children didn't just survive, but thrived. During one particularly intense planning session, Jake's sister Rebecca visited the ranch. She'd driven down from Dallas, worried about rumors she'd heard regarding her brother's latest venture. Rebecca was a successful attorney, practical and analytical, nothing like Jake's emotional decision-making style. Jake, people are saying you've lost your mind, she said without preamble, settling into a chair across from his desk. They're saying you're going to bankrupt yourself for a bunch of kids you've never even met. Jake looked at his sister, seeing their mother's features reflected in her face. Rebecca had always been the sensible one, the one who planned ahead and calculated risks. But she'd also never experienced the poverty that shaped Jake's early years. What do you think, Rebecca? Am I crazy? She sighed and picked up one of the financial reports scattered across his desk. Financially? Yes, absolutely. This project will consume everything you've built. But, knowing you, knowing why you're doing this, I think you'd regret it forever if you didn't try. So you support my decision? I think you're going to do this regardless of what anyone says, Rebecca replied with a slight smile. But, if you're determined to bankrupt yourself for these children, then, I want to help make sure you do it right. My law firm will handle all the legal work pro bono. Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward his sister. Having family support meant everything, even if she thought he was making a mistake. Thank you, Rebecca. That means more than you know. Just promise me something, Jake. Promise me you'll have an exit strategy. If this starts failing, if you're truly in danger of losing everything, promise me you'll step back before you destroy yourself completely. Jake hesitated. The promise Rebecca wanted was exactly the kind of escape clause his mother had never had. Mary Morrison had worked herself to death because she had no choice, no safety net, no way out. These children were in the same situation. I can't promise that, Rebecca. If I'm going to do this, I have to be all in. These kids need to know that someone won't abandon them when things get difficult. Rebecca studied her brother's face, recognizing the stubborn determination that had made him successful in business. Then, I guess I'll have to make sure you don't fail. 3 days later, Jake received a call that would test his resolve before his plan even began. Tom Bradley, the director of Cedar Valley Children's Home, was on the line with urgent news. Jake, we have a problem. The state just moved up our closure date. We have to transfer all the children within 60 days, not the 6 months we originally planned. Jake's heart sank. 60 days wasn't nearly enough time to complete the legal paperwork, facility upgrades, and staff hiring necessary to take over operations. What changed, Tom? Budget politics. The state wants to show immediate cost savings, so they're accelerating the closure timeline. I've been fighting it for weeks, but the decision is final. Jake paced around his office, his mind racing through possibilities. What happens to the children if we can't find alternative arrangements? Most will go to state facilities that are already overcrowded. Some of the older kids might end up in group homes or transitional housing. A few might get lucky with foster families, but, at their ages, it's unlikely. The image of Maria, Tommy, Sarah, and all the other children being scattered across the state system filled Jake with determination. He'd seen state facilities during his research. They weren't bad places, but they weren't homes either. Children became numbers, processed through systems designed for efficiency rather than love. Tom, I'm going to make you an offer, and I need you to take it seriously. What if I could guarantee funding for Cedar Valley immediately? Today, if necessary? Jake, I appreciate your generosity, but we're talking about millions of dollars. Even with emergency funding, the regulatory approval process alone takes months. What if I told you I was prepared to personally guarantee every expense, hire the best lawyers in the state to expedite the legal process, and take full responsibility for every child's welfare starting immediately? The phone was silent for so long that Jake wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice shaky with emotion. Jake, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that if you'll have me, I want to become the permanent guardian and funding source for Cedar Valley Children's Home. Every child, every program, every dream they have for their futures. Tom's voice broke slightly. Do you understand what you're offering? The legal liability alone could destroy you if something goes wrong. Jake thought about his mother, working 3 jobs and never complaining. He thought about the promise he'd made as a 15-year-old boy standing beside her hospital bed. He thought about 300 children who deserved the same chance at success he'd been given. Tom, the only thing that could destroy me is knowing I had the power to help and chose not to use it. The next morning, Jake's ranch became the headquarters for the most ambitious rescue operation of his life. Rebecca arrived with a team of lawyers. Robert brought accountants and financial advisors. Child welfare experts flew in from across the country to consult on the transition process. Within 48 hours, Jake had committed $25 million to saving Cedar Valley Children's Home. The money would cover facility improvements, staff salaries for 5 years, educational programs, medical care, and a substantial emergency fund for unexpected expenses. But money was only the beginning. Jake knew that real success would require something much more valuable than wealth. It would require love, patience, and the kind of commitment that couldn't be bought or sold. As he signed the final papers transferring ownership of Cedar Valley to his newly created foundation, Jake felt his mother's presence as strongly as if she were standing beside him. This wasn't just about saving a children's home. It was about proving that promises mattered, that success meant nothing without compassion, and that sometimes the most important investments were the ones that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. The children of Cedar Valley would soon learn that their lives had been changed forever by a millionaire cowboy who understood that true wealth came not from what you accumulated, but from what you were willing to give away. And Jake Morrison was about to discover that keeping a promise made to a dying mother would teach him lessons about love, family, and purpose that all his business success had never provided. The rescue was just beginning, but Jake already knew he'd made the right choice. Some promises were worth everything, and this was one of them.